Today is the 19th Sunday of the year. Our Gospel is taken from Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. I don't know of any other passage in the Gospels that captures the imagination quite like this one. Peter attempts the impossible. He tries to walk on water. Now, John and Mark both have texts where they speak of Jesus walking on water, but only Matthew has Peter walking on water. It is in its own way a beautiful, a daring, and even comical moment in the Gospel. It prompts me to wonder about the poetic imagination in interpreting the Scriptures, the life of Jesus, and our place in it all. That sometimes the rational mind can be an obstacle when we try and figure things out. On the 30th of August this year, it'll be 10 years since the death of Seamus Heaney, one of the greatest poets that ever lived. He ascribes to poetry the fact that it expanded his imagination and his mind and his horizons from an early time in his life. In 1995, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. In his speech in Stockholm, accepting that prize, in a particularly lyrical passage, he says, "The platform here feels more like a space station than a stepping stone." So that is why, for once in my life, I am permitting myself the luxury of walking on air. I credit poetry for making this spacewalk possible. I credit it immediately because of a line I fairly recently wrote for myself and anyone else who may be listening. To walk on air against your better judgment. Now, law, doctrine, morality are necessary for a sane society. There has to be some fundamental agreement in these matters, otherwise we'll descend into barbarism. However, law, doctrine, and morality, left to themselves, tend to very easily degenerate into legalism, dogmatism, and moralism. They need a broader context beyond themselves to save them from themselves in a way. I think the poetic imagination is of great assistance here. The poetic imagination reminds us that there's always more, that we can never claim to have completed this human search for truth, for beauty, for goodness, that there will always be just off stage more to discover, more that will expand our horizons and relativize what we already know, put it into context. The more then gives a context which saves us from tiny-mindedness and the limitations that, for example, law and dogma and morality impose. Now, in our Catholic tradition, we place a high priority on sacramentality. In its broadest sense, sacramentality is the belief that in the material is the spiritual. In the human is the divine. In the temporal is the eternal. In the comprehensible is the incomprehensible. And so we have many rituals and symbols that concretely keep sacramentality, keep the mind implied in sacramentality, the poetic imagination of sacramentality alive. It behoves us, therefore, when we engage in these rituals and symbols, to be in them, not to perform them in a perfunctory way. When we make the sign of the cross, when we genuflect, when we bow, when we turn to people next to us and say, "Peace be with you," when we hold out our hand and say, "Amen" to the bread of life. To be human is to be in between the divine and the human, the eternal and the temporal. The poetic imagination prompts us to recognize that we're always in this in-between world. All we have to do is pay attention. Walk on air against your better judgment.